Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the podcast. The two guests I have on today make for very interesting conversation and have well thought out, long form opinions when discussing matters concerning Everton Football Club when I've spoken to them in the past. So by that logic, I'm very pleased to be joined by Richard Buxton and DS today. Evening, gents. How are things?
I think we're both going to be polite here and wait for the other one to speak. So I'll say hello. Good to speak to you, Max. Richard, you and we probably read each other's tweets and other things like for many, many years. So it's good to have a chance to speak to you directly as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always good to speak to people who you sort of see on social media and listen to the podcast in your case. So it's looking forward to it. It's going to be quite good.
Yeah.
Thanks for agreeing to come together and speak to me, guys. As I say, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Now, there are obviously a wide range of interesting points of discussion following the conclusion of that season, not just Everton related, but across world football. But given the Evertonian following that the three of us have, and the fact that I think from a neutral perspective, Everton make for an interesting case study at this moment in time, that's the agenda today. So I'm sorry to any listeners that were expecting anything else. Firstly, I'll go to you, Richard, before handing over to Paul. I could easily start by asking, was that the worst season that you've ever experienced from an Everton perspective, which it definitely has been for me? But I think to put an interesting spin on that, what has made this season different compared to those that you've experienced in the past?
Well, for starters, I think it was the most surreal season that I can remember in any time of covering Merseyside football. And even, I remember, 94, 98, obviously not, involved in it, but I always remember how mad that season was for Everton. And obviously, I've got experience with Liverpool of similarly chaotic situations where they dice with relegation and administration and stuff like that. But this was unlike anything I can remember, and it all started in the summer when the club sort of, and I mentioned this to someone, a supporter, and I won't name drop them, but I mentioned it a few months ago to them about what the hell happened, and they said they just showed the board and the owner show complete contempt for the fans. They showed they didn't care what the fans thought about appointing Rafael Benitez, and I think that's been reflected in the Grand Old Team survey that came out this week. I mean, confidence in the board is at an all-time low. But in terms of the season, I think it started off in the summer when they appointed Benitez with, despite the raft of protests, you went past Goodison on an average weeknight and there was banners up there was spray paint on the Bullens Road. There was a lot, going on. And Farhad Moshiri still pressed ahead with his appointments, knowing that it wouldn't be well received and believing that he was right. And his justification of it was quite strange. He went on TalkSport as he used to do, saying that I backed the fans when they protested against Martinez. I went with their wishes when they didn't want Moyes back. Now, when he said that, I went, hang on, I don't remember that. I remember Everton fans stomaching the idea of Moyes coming back because it was either him or Mark Hughes. And then Carl Ancelotti miraculously came into the fold. So it was almost as if Moshiri said then, it's my turn now to decide. And from then on, I think the club structurally was ripped apart by Benitez. Let's not make any bones about that. He tried to do as much damage as possible in that 6-month window. But I think the season starts off on a bad note because you had the wrong manager coming in, obviously a manager who was well regarded and had got a good tune out the players leaving. And then we obviously had the players suspended due to a police investigation, which is still ongoing. And then it progressively got worse. And even after Benitez got sacked, the fans were being slapped in the face. Bill Kenwright saying to the fans outside Goodison after the Villa game, it's not 27 years of misery. You've had good times. And it's like, it was just absolutely astounding that we got to that stage. And then obviously you've got bad actors coming into it like Keir Jarab, Jim White. Then Moshiri goes and does something again completely wild, trying to avoid Victor Pereira, and we can get onto, the links with that super agent we just mentioned. And obviously everything happened with Alisher Usmanov and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So, it was, for most of the season, it was pretty chaotic. But I think the fact that the fans managed to coalesce around, I'd say a unifying candidate in Frank Lampard meant that he pulled it back from the brink, but God, it was close. And, going to Goodison in those final few games, Palace, Brentford, Chelsea, you were on tenterhooks, you were watching games, even when you weren't at them, you were watching them, behind your fingers, because you just thought, this can't happen. Everton can't be relegated from the Premier League, from the top flight of English football after 68 years. You just thought it's a bad dream. And, thankfully we've got the summer to have a reset on it all. But yeah, I think we've all aged prematurely over the past 9 months, it's fair to say.
Yeah, I most certainly have. I think it's put about 10 years on me. But Paul, in previous conversations that we've had, we've often, shared stories of seasons past in the history of Everton Football Club, the more successful ones, shall we say. How does this one rank up in your experience?
Wow, I think Richard said much of what I was going to say. I think if you take like a top-down position, so if you just look at it overall, because Richard covered many of the points excellently, thank you, Richard. But it is the culmination of so many things which a lot of people have talked about in the past about if you don't have good governance, if you don't have the proper relationship between the owner and the board and the chairman, and then the relationship between the board and the footballing side of the operation, then you end up getting into enormous difficulties. And if you don't have what I've talked about in the past in terms of alignment of interest, so everybody understanding that actually the most important thing and the thing that creates most value for everybody that's associated with Everton Football Club is actually the success of Everton Football Club. It's not about your own little fiefdom. It's not about whether you're a member of the executive team or you're a member of the academy or whether you're the shareholder. And actually, the really interesting, sexy stuff is talking to Kia Jorabachian or talking to the any other the super agents. What we've seen here is the culmination of years and years and years of very gradual decline under the previous ownership and the previous board, going all the way back to actually before the start of the Premier League, going back to the Carter days. Then the whole thing is totally accelerated by it's a bit like I've said this before, it's a bit like a fire that's just been smoldering, and the Everton fire has been smoldering for 20 years. And then all of a sudden somebody comes along and throws a whole load of wood on it. And not only throws wood on it, but actually throws a load of petrol on it as well. And it just ignites and poof. And what we end up with is a situation where we ended up this year where, we're totally hamstrung financially from a regulatory point of view. We might even be hamstrung from a cash flow point of view in terms of the ability of the owners to keep on funding because of events which, are outside of his control, the Russian invasion of Ukraine being the primary bit. But so all of these things which could have been mitigated against previously, but never were because nobody was taking enough attention, resulted in Rafa Benitez being the manager, him having no relationship with the fans, having no relationship with the club, having no relationship with the players, and seemingly having a philosophy about football which belonged to a football club from 20 years ago. So it is absolutely, there's no surprise that it ended in disaster. The question, of course, is why it was allowed to happen in the first place, and if indeed now circumstances are different so that it can't happen again. I think we're lucky that we got Frank Lampard. I don't think he's the world's greatest football manager, but I think he understands the football club, and I think he has ambition. And as he's shown throughout his career, he has a willingness to work harder than most in order to achieve what it is that he wants to achieve. And he has a credibility and credence about him that allows him to attract, really good people into the club. So I think if you look at Everton's what do they call it, backroom staff, so the old boot room from Anfield, we're almost as good as anybody else in terms of the people that we've got. That's not down to the club. I think that's down to Lampard. So I think we're in a better position than we probably might have expected to be. But there's so much that needs to be done to make sure that the better position that we're in is now built upon, and that we don't fall back on the errors of the last 6 years. Sorry, that was a long rant, but there you go.
Oh, no, not at all. And I think how Everton Football Club move forward is definitely something that I want to talk about shortly. But I think the last time we spoke, Paul, wasn't long after the appointments of Rafael Benitez, where you helped me see the perspective that Everton's most successful times previously have predominantly come under former players, and that Benitez could possibly be the antidote that brings success back to the football club. Well, that may be the case eventually with Frank Lampard, but it certainly wasn't with his predecessor. I think you've hit the nail on the head perfectly, both you and Richard, that his time in charge of the football club could be epitomised with poor decision making, both on and off the pitch, lengthy injury list, poor performances, results, and ultimately the unrest amongst the fan base, which leads me to what I believe.
Sorry, Max, can I just cut across you there?
Yeah, no problem.
I think one of the really interesting points, Richard, would be really interested to hear your view on this, is that it didn't have to be this way. I think properly controlled, properly managed, having strong leadership around him, Rafa Benitez could have been much better than he was. I think the real difficulty is one, okay, put his baggage aside for one moment, the fact that he knew Liverpool better than he knew the City, and certainly better than he knew Everton. The fact is that a guy with his personality, his domineering personality, I think Benitez is a bully. The fact that there was no leadership around him to stop him from doing what he did, which was, not effective, and it didn't in any way help the club long term, because he destroyed a lot of what was possibly good at the club. I think there's 2 points. First of all, Rafa was the wrong person. But secondly, the point was that he was allowed to do the damage that he did, and nobody stepped in to do it until such a point as where it couldn't just possibly continue. And my worry is that, first of all, there's been no changes in the people that allowed that to happen. And secondly, there's probably very little recognition that the people who are still here who allowed that to happen are probably equally culpable in terms of the damage that was created.
Yeah, I go along with that. I think you're right about Benitez as well. I think, I'd seen firsthand the damage he did at Liverpool. I've likened him to Donald Trump, because he sort of has this really sort of robust personality where he thinks he's always in the right, and he shows division, and he creates factions which don't need to be created. And the problem was that, a club like Everton, as you say, set aside his baggage. And, you mentioned it before, Paul, his brand of football is outdated. It's 15, 20 years outdated. It hasn't been in style for a good 2 decades at least. You go back to probably 2003 when he was at his peak, and then maybe a little bit after with Liverpool. But, that doesn't really compensate for the fact that he just caused problems. And as I alluded to before, the structural damage he's done in terms of the first team personnel. Obviously, we saw Dan Donachie leave, we saw Marcel Brands walk out, which, time will tell on Kevin Farwell, but to lose Marcel Brands, who for my mind was one of the best administrators in football, and you look at the cast list of players he's identified and recruited at PSV, it's appalling that he was forced out because Benitez had this desire for control. But as you say, no one was willing to hold him to account. It reminded me almost of when the Brexit deal was getting pushed through Parliament, and you thought at some point the adults are going to come into the room and take the toys off the kids, and common sense will prevail. And at one point it felt like this is never going to happen. This is going to be like the football equivalent of Brexit. It's just going to, we're going to go down this dark path, and there's going to be no coming back from it. Unfortunately, the result eventually forced Micheli's hand on Benitez, but as you say, the damage he did, I think we'll probably won't see the full picture of it probably for a good 12 to 18 months at least.
Can I just ask, sorry, Max, Richard, you made an interesting point there. Do you think Brand's demise was purely down to Rafa Benitez, or because I hold a slightly different view, but anyway, I'll give you my view in a second. Was Brands as effective as he should have been?
Probably not. I mean, how many actual managers did Marcel Brands appoint? Because I think you can probably count them on. You could count them on your knuckles, basically. That's how many you appointed. You know, every manager he worked with. Marco Silva was preordained by Machiri because when he was at Watford, Carlo Ancelotti again, another one preordained, and Benitez as well. I don't think Marcel Brands had any real input on the managerial appointment to Everton Football Club in the 3.5 years he was there, which is sort of a bit of a self-defeating purpose. Why have a director of football who's not going to appoint a manager? You should all be aligned. You should all be able to be, again, and it comes back to this issue that the club has had, that it's not been pulling in the same direction collectively. So you've had Machiri doing one thing, but Kenwright doing another, and then Brands and to a lesser extent Steve Walsh were on the sidelines as directors of football. They were sort of responsible for recruitment, but when it came to the actual big job, the important job, they were basically nullified by those above them. So I think Brands suffered as a consequence, but also I think, I mean, Benitez probably should have been sacked after the Merseyside derby. I mean, I was in Goodison that night, and I've never seen the background be as toxic and as volatile as it was. I mean, it said something that they had a row of 10 policemen flanked on either side of the park and exit gates. I think they were expecting some real pushback from the fans when the likes of Kenwright and Benitez left the ground. But I think Brands fell on his sword because I think he just thought Benitez is going to try and rip this apart, and I can't be seen as letting this happen. And I think he resigned on principle. But probably as well, there will have been an element of, I haven't appointed a manager in my entire time here. I'm copping the flack for the poor recruitment when actually I'm picking out possibly some of the better signings that we've made. And he probably thought, I don't need this. And you look at where he's ended up back at PSV. You know, he obviously knew there was a job waiting for him at some point there. So it probably was an easy choice to make. But I think Benitez did force his hand because if you recall, Brand signed a new contract just last year, and within 6 months that was up in smoke.
Yeah, and I think that's your final point is part. I think we're in broad agreement. The only thing I would say that's different from what you said is I just don't think that Brands ever imposed himself upon the football club in the manner in which he should have done. He was ultimately the football expert for a number of years, and nobody should have questioned his, well, not questioned his football judgment, but nobody should have superseded his football judgment in terms of, and you made the point actually, he never recruited a manager. So that's one point. And then secondly, in terms of, some of the player selection decisions or player recruitment decisions that we made, or rather Fahad Mashiri or Kia Jurabachin made. I mean, it's in the past now, I know, but the question will be, and it's really, I think the interesting thing is the difference between what Brands did and was allowed to do and what Brands allowed other people to do, and what Thelwell's done since he's been here. I don't know how much or how close to Thelwell you are, but I think there's a clear difference between the two approaches.
I mean, it depends on when you say there's a difference in approach. I think there's definitely. I mean, Brand is different to Thelwell in the same way he was different to Steve Walsh before him. But I think it was interesting that one of Thelwell's first acts was to bring back the scouting operations manager who left his post under Benitez, Dan Purdy, I think his name is. And he, I asked people at Everton, what's the story there? Does he know him? Have they got previous? And he said no, just brought him back. So maybe there's an element of Thelwell can see the good side of what Everton did under the Brands and the people that Brands brought in. But at the same time, he's also going to put his own stamp on it. So, I mean, the jury's still out. We've got to get through the summer and see how, the squad is looking, how the finances are looking. And so ultimately, what business did they do with Thelwell and Lampard at the helm? Because that's going to be key. And that should be the prevailing view should be that those two men should have total control and full remit over the football side of things, because in the past few years that has been the case.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. From my perspective and from the people that I know, I don't know Thelwell directly, so first of all, I have to say that. But I know people who do know him, and who do know him very well. The view is that if he came into the club and if he didn't impose himself on the club very quickly, then he would end up being no more effective than Marcel Brands was, regardless of any qualifications, experience, and ability that he has. So therefore, when he came into the club, it was very important that he made a couple of statements and acted through those statements in order to demonstrate his ability, but also demonstrate, more importantly than that, his authority over the rest of the club. He was director of football. That means he's responsible for everything that goes on in terms of football. And, ultimately, whatever decisions were made were down to him, not down to other people. And I think that was the advice that was given to him. And I think he took that on board. And so therefore, he looked for, what is it that I can do that will create an immediate effect in that sense? So looking at the academy, looking at the previous reliance upon David Unsworth, and I'm not talking about David Unsworth as an individual. I don't know him, never spoken to him, never met him. But looking at whether he was the right person to move the academy forward. Thelwell's view was that he wasn't. And therefore, despite what had happened in the past and despite the protection and the defense of David Unsworth that the board had given previously, he wanted absolutely a new person, or in fact, two people, as it turns out, to be running the academy and to be running the under-23 side. So that for him was an opportunity to demonstrate his views, but also to demonstrate his authority and his expertise over the owner and over the board. And he achieved that. But I think that's only the beginning. What he has to do this summer is to say to Farhad Moshiri, understand that you really enjoy, the cut and thrust of recruiting people, negotiating contracts, this, that, and the other. But actually, you're not the expert in this. I'm the expert in this. So anything that happens has to go through me. And I think that's a critical point about this summer, forgetting all the stuff about finance and stuff for a minute, is that Kevin Thelwell has to control recruitment, and he has to control who leaves the club. And that's what has not happened, if that's good English, in the 6.5 years that Moshiri has been effectively the majority shareholder, then the majority shareholder. And I think that's the big difference this summer. This summer is the time when Thelwell has to prove himself as an effective director of football. And that means that whatever happens goes through him, not goes through Moshiri, Ken Wright, Kia Jorabachian, or any of the super agents who are obviously not part of the football club, but have an interest in the football club.
There's a great...
There is a danger with that, though. Sorry, Max.
No, go on, Richard. No problem.
I was just going to say, there is a slight danger with that, because I think when you look at Thelwell's track record at Wolves, the players he brought in, how many of them went through Jorge Mendes' stable? And this was actually something I mentioned to Max last year when Nuno was in the frame before Benitez. It can have benefits, but at the same time, when you look at his track record, how many of those players that Wolves signed, you look at Neves, Jota, people like that, how many of them came through Mendes' stable? And I fear that might be an issue. So for fans might be dead against that, but I think that might be a necessary evil to get the club to where it needs to be in terms of recruiting enough quality players to sort of get back up the table.
I was just going to say, there's a great interview with Lampard soon after he was appointed, where he explained that because of the situation at Everton, there wasn't time to implement the likes of a culture, values, or philosophy. Now, I think he's definitely achieved that short-term objective of keeping them in the Premier League and bolstering that relationship between fans and players. And like you're outlining, as much of it is down to Frank and, of course, Kevin Thelwell to improve the performance of the club as a footballing entity. The culture of the club is essentially something that comes from the top down. that is something that you talk about regularly on Talking the Blues, Paul. So in regards to values, what values do you think Everton need to implement at the club? And in turn, what sort of culture do you want to see develop as a consequence of that?
I think it's really simple. I think you have to either have to have more money than anybody else, or you have to have more talent than anybody else. And if you haven't got more money and if you haven't got more talent, then you have to work much smarter, much more cleverly, and you have to know the market that you can use in order to achieve what it is that you want to achieve. And there have been periods in Everton's history where we've been smarter, where we've had more money, where we've had better people than anybody else. But at the moment, we don't have any of those three things, because we've squandered most of the money. We're tight against our regulatory position, and being totally honest, Frank, the people that we have running the club are not the best in class. Then if you make a competitive analysis against our board, our owner, and other boards and other owners, then they don't compete. So we have to work harder. I don't think there's any magic wand here, unless we throw in the idea that a new owner comes in. But assuming that a new owner doesn't come in, we have to work harder, we have to work smarter, and we have to figure out a way of as quickly as possible eradicating the liabilities of the past, so the last 6 years, and building on a future going forward. If that doesn't sound very convincing, well, it's because actually the position that we're in is extremely difficult, and there's no obvious route to getting to where we need to get to.
I mean, I'll just add to that. Sorry, Max. I'll just add to that by saying, I think, in terms of getting to where Everton needs to be, I think it comes, if the people who are in positions of power now are going to stay in power, they've got to show a bit of backbone. Now that extends from the commercial side of things, because I find it absolutely astounding that the club told us in March that they didn't feel they needed to have a sleeve sponsor, because they weren't happy with the nature of the potential partners that were on the table. They were obviously concerned with gambling and cryptocurrency, which the latter seems to have been vindicated on their part. But for 2 seasons, Everton haven't had a sleeve sponsor. You don't know how much of an impact that might have had on the financial picture. They're still in the process of obviously announcing a new sponsor for next season, because they haven't come on board. And I understand a lot of that is aligned to the club staying in the Premier League, but at the same time, why weren't they making these moves sooner? It feels like everything's sort of on the hoof again. And as well, I think the club needs to show a bit of backbone in terms of how to deal with people and what I'd call the bad actors, cage your option first and foremost, but also in the media, because I can speak from experience. Everton are very quick to pull up the local media and people who work on the patch if we say something or write something that they feel is a bit out of turn. I remember after the FA Cup defeat at Anfield in 2020, I was quite critical of the club and the way the players were reacting to it, and the club said, we feel you're a bit out of line. I said, fine, respect that, but that's my game. But then you have people like Jim White who are being used as conduits by Farhad Moshiri, and then turning it on its head and spitting venom at the fans, at people within the club, like Denise Barrett-Baxendale. I think we all remember his response when she was asked to comment on Sam Allardyce's sacking. And then you look at it, last season, especially Guillaume Vallier. Okay, we know he's close to Benitez, but he was allowed to paint this inaccurate picture of the fan base, calling them toxic and antagonising them at every turn. And it seemed like there was no accountability from the club to say, hang on, you're out of line here. Because, and I know it's an extreme example, but you look at the way Liverpool have responded to this Champions League final fallout and how they've backed their fans up. Everton never backed their fans up. And I feel like an element of that is because there's this sort of suspicion that the fans can't be supported because they've spoken out against the board in the past. But it shouldn't be that black and white. It should be a case of if they're your supporters and people are attacking them, you should have their back. And that, for me, is one of those things that Everton haven't done with the fan base. I know they've done a lot of good things in the past with the community stuff and obviously in the past few months with the atmosphere, but I don't feel like they've had the fans back, and I don't feel like they've had the clubs back on a commercial level or even a moral level. So for me, that's something that needs to change.
Can I jump in, Richard? You make a really brilliant point there about the impact of the fans. I think there are two reasons why Everton were not relegated. One was the individual brilliance on a few occasions. Pickford's save against Chelsea, Mikalenko's goal, even DCL's goal at the end of the season that stopped us from being relegated. But actually, the most important factor in terms of us not being relegated was the fact that the fans themselves recognised that the club themselves couldn't get us over the line, couldn't get us to the point of safety. And if the club don't believe that the fans have a positive impact and an ability to positively influence events after the events of the last few months, then I'll give up, because the evidence is there before us. We all know what's wrong with the club. We all have individual thoughts about individuals within the clubs, but everybody put that to one side. And the most important thing for the last sort of couple of months has been making sure that Everton's succeeded in staying in the Premier League. And much of that was driven by individual supporters who just ignored everything else and just said, this is what we have to do. We have to support the club. And if the club can't recognise that, then I think we're in a really difficult position.
I think the club have definitely accepted and acknowledged the importance of fan support. I mean, from my own experience of covering the coach welcomes before the last few games, obviously Chelsea, Brentford, Palace, and even Finch Farm before they went to Leicester. I mean, 400, 500 people turn up on Finch Lane on a Saturday afternoon when they had nothing on is incredible. And and you look at Goodison, it's been quite a surreal sight seeing grown men and kids walking around with blue rashes on the face after being in the midst of all that chaos. But it's I think it's something that probably should have happened sooner. And I think you've got to give credit to people like the 27 campaign who were big drivers in that, because this all started really with the sit-in after the Villa game. But that itself has roots in the Everton board-out movement in 2015. So this isn't like people have just turned up and rocked up and decided that they're going to take the lead. This is people who've been active voices in the fan base for years. And I think the fact that the club are starting to accept and acknowledge the importance of them, and you look at the way they were brought in to see the banners for the Brentford game, and you looked at how they were they liaised with these people for the Palace match. I think the club is starting to understand how important the fans are, and this outdated notion that the fans should be kept at arm's length, the sort of keep them in the great unwashed sort of position. I think that's gone, because I think the fans, and I know what you're saying, Paul, about players have made an impact, but in my mind, the only reason why Everton didn't get relegated and weren't another one of these cautionary tales of a big English club that went to the wall like so many we've seen down the years, notably Leeds United, is because of the fans. I think it would be so easy for the players to give up if the fans went on the case. And I think we've seen at Goodison, when the fans are on you, and Ben Foster alluded to it earlier in the season, when the fans are on the team's backs, it is fight or flight. And I think the players responded because the fans got behind them. And I think Lampard helped with that. And I think the fact that, there was a great saying that did the rounds in the back end of last season was that Benitez might have known the city, but Lampard understands Everton. And that was absolutely perfect, smart. It's really funny because it goes back to that old saying from, Bill Shankly, who, Goodison became a bit of a home from home in his later life, that, there's a holy trinity of players, managers and fans, and no one else comes into it. And in that moment, the fan base coalesced around Lampard and the team, and everyone will have their own opinions on the players, everyone will have their own opinion on Lampard, but they came behind the team, and that is what got Everton over the line, because the scenes at Leicester don't happen, the scenes outside the Finch Farm before, they don't happen. Chelsea, Brentford, even though they lost that game, and Palace, none of that happens without the fans. The fans are the ones who grab that club by the scruff of the neck and dragged it over the finish line, and the players had to follow suit. And that's, I think Everton will do more with the fans, I think, moving forward. I know they've done stuff with the originals in the past, but I think they're going to have to ramp it up a bit more now, because it can't be on, and Lampard said it can't be on the fans to cheer them in every week. There needs to be something a bit more meaningful in place so that the fans don't have to line the streets every week. Maybe for bigger games, maybe for the day, they might do it, but they shouldn't have to be, delivering a rallying call every week because the players haven't turned up. So, there's a lot that needs to change, but I think the fans are going to become integral to that, and I think the club has embraced that to a degree.
Yeah, I want to say I'm pleased that we've come onto this, because I believe what started with the 27 years campaign is directly correlated with the scenes of solidarity and unity that you outlined there, and that we saw towards the back end of last season. You think, particularly at Goodison Park with the coach welcomes, and poignantly with, that away day at Leicester where they're singing Spirit of the Blues for near enough the full game. I had a back and forth with you, Richard, about that and the importance that had in pulling the team over the line and retaining their Premier League status. Do you think it's a rational ask to have the supporters like that for the foreseeable future outside Goodison Park? Could you imagine those scenes, for example, at a Bournemouth at home?
I don't think it's sustainable, Max. Really, I don't. I mean, I've just, the last weekend I was at 2 weeks ago, I was at Anfield for the final game of the season, and Liverpool fans around the streets for that, and made a big thing of it, and obviously did it again for their own parade at the weekend. But that's not sustainable. You don't see that, as you say, for the Bournemouth at home. That's the argument I have with a lot of people about. It doesn't always work for Bournemouth at home unless something is on the line. I don't think it works. You're expecting fans to be fired up every week without fail, and I know we do it on the continent, but even Barcelona, a club I know very well, devoted to almost, they don't do it every week. They do it when the chips are down. They do it when there's a big game coming up, but it's not sustainable over a 38-game season. I mean, I know maybe in Turkey where the fans are a bit bonkers, they might do it most weeks, but I don't think you can do it for a 38-game season or a 45-game season with a cup run included. I think something's got to give on that one, and I think that's where the players have to turn up. We shouldn't have gone into Brentford, on mid-May thinking this is going to be this is one where everyone has to be up for it. It should have been a sort of, it's a game that should have been a meandering game really, but because of the severity, everyone had to be up for it. It had to be a cup final atmosphere. I don't think you can replicate that, as I say. Clubs with a bigger history in this sort of choreographed display, I think it's fair to say, because I think when you look at how it all adds with the flags and the smoke grenades and everything else, I think there is an element of that to it. But I don't think you can do that. And you look at across the park, they don't do it every week. They do it when there's special occasions or when there's something riding on it, but they don't do it every week, and there's a reason for that, because it loses the novelty. Now, I wouldn't dare say Liverpool and Everton fans are similar, because we know they're not. They're very different characteristics, but I think the principles still apply, because it is draining. Can you imagine trying to do that on a cold December afternoon when you're playing against Brighton at home and there's nothing on it? There's no jeopardy. There's no incentive to, you're not going to top the table if you win that game. You're not going to be in the relegation zone if you don't. I don't think it's sustainable. But I do think the feel good elements needs to be embraced and run with by the club and the fans. I think they need to, it comes back to this point about everyone needs to be on the same hymn sheet. So I think there will be elements of it which can be taken into the new season, but expecting people to line the route in the hundreds and thousands to on Goodison Road and down Walton Lane, I think probably is a bit of a tough ask, and you wouldn't want them to, because it shouldn't come down to that really. That's a sort of a very extreme case of, when there is something on the line, whether it's survival or success, that should be when it is. But I think in a box on the season where Everton maybe finish 8th, 7th, maybe 10th at worst, then I don't think you can probably apply it to that.
Would you share that sentiment, Paul?
Not wholly, to be honest. And I talked to the 27 campaign, who are just part of the overall atmosphere campaign, or atmosphere group. And I think until such a time as the club and the players are in a position where they can do it for themselves, then we as fans have to work that extra bit harder. I get totally the argument that this is not sustainable, 38 games a season or 19 games a season at Goodison. But maybe that's the cost of wanting success, that we have to do something different from everybody else, and we have to prove what other people can't do, we can do?
I mean, the issue with that, sorry, Max,
No,
just the issue with that, I mean, if I completely get where Paul's coming from, and I do agree that, there needs to be something sustained, but my concern is just that, I mean, you look at the way, the Man City parade is a classic example, the way it was sort of skewed that, because not everyone wasn't packing the streets out, it sort of didn't have the same impact as maybe, it would have had if Everton was around in the city streets. So I just fear that the numbers aren't going to be there next season if there's nothing on the line. I think people wanted to be part of it because it was a phenomenon first and foremost because it had never been done at Goodison.
Yeah.
I think people wanted to be a part of that, and that's understandable. And you support people's want to do that, and that's absolutely fine by me. I just worry that when the weather bites or when there's nothing on the line, I don't feel like there's going to be the level of people. It's not going to be 4 or 5 deep on Goodison Road, and that's when maybe it loses the impact. And also if you phase it out and the results start tailing off a little bit, I think that'll there'll be questions asked about that. So I agree that there needs to be something there needs to be a foot on the pedal going into next season, but whether it's the coach welcomes, I'm not entirely sure. I just feel like there's probably an element of risk with that. But I mean, something has to be done because we can't be coming back in 12 months time and saying they've avoided relegation again, or they've gone down and what's the next move, because Everton should be able to go from one season to the next, not necessarily accepting being just the mainstay of the Premier League, but I think it should be a bare minimum. And then from that point on, you can go down the Neville Southall route of aiming for first, and then if you can't get first, aim for second, and so forth. But we need to get to a situation where Everton aren't in the position they were in this year, because I don't think anyone wants that. Us three certainly don't, and I'm pretty sure the entire fan base doesn't. So something has to give. But whether it's coach welcomes coming back, I'm not sure. I mean, opening day maybe it might be a nice catalyst, but you look at the results at the start of the previous season under Carlyle and Ancelotti, we didn't need any sort of catalyst then in lockdown, because the right people were involved, and maybe it'll just take a couple of personnel changes, and we could see that again. You never know. But as I say, I'm just not sure what the solution is really. But I just feel like if the novelty wears off, then what's the damage to that going to be?
I think the flip side to that argument, Richard, and I respect totally what you've just said, is that if you'd asked somebody in the mid 1980s whether it was possible for a team that finished 16th to have capacity crowds at Goodison for every single week, they would have said no, because when we were winning loads of stuff, we only ever had capacity crowds against Liverpool, and at the end of the season when actually a trophy was awarded, like for example the QPR game. So the point of saying that is that things can change, and if you put the right narrative out there, and if you put the right incentives out there, fan behavior can change. So why can't greeting the coach and then being able to do something else after that in the 2 hours between, or the hour and a half between greeting the coach and watching the game, if we can throw something else in there that attracts people, why can't that become part of the natural match day experience? So rather than going to a local pub and spending an hour and a half before the game in a local pub, you actually go and greet the coach, or enough people go and greet the coach, and then they go and do something else in the fan zone or in the ground or whatever. And that all becomes part of the new normal match day experience.
Yeah, I can see that, and I agree that there needs to be something put in place, but it has to be organic. It can't just be a case of someone comes up with an idea and then that's it's a short-lived one. There needs to be obviously some serious thought to that. But I mean, I don't see why there can't be a new normal. I just, based on my own experience of seeing it in England and on the continent, on my own doorstep with the other lot, I just don't know if it has legs. But I mean, Everton had never done coach welcome before this season just gone, so anything is possible. But I'd say maybe I'm looking at it from a sort of sceptical journalistic point of view, but I'd say the evidence doesn't really support longevity, but maybe Everton could be the one to buck the trend. It won't be the first time.
Yeah, I think that's a real interesting discussion between the both of you there, but some really valid points. And I'm sure both can attest to this, we've seen firsthand, and I can hold my hands up and say that I've been a part of this, have seen the volatility within the fan base when things aren't going our way. And you talked about it earlier, referencing that Merseyside derby under Benitez, how volatile Goodison Park can be. Now, the only way I can see coach welcomes, etc., having sustainability is if they channel that energy that is viewed widely as being toxic. If they flip that on its head and use it as a force for good, which we have seen for the back end of this season, it is just a question of whether that motivation is going to be there for nothing games, which I don't know if I can see.
But that's the point I'm making about fan behavior can change. The idea that we can, as I said earlier, the idea that we can have like full houses every week for a team that finishes 16th, even 10 years ago would have been thought of as being ridiculous, because it just wouldn't have happened. And I think if you project it in terms of when we go to Bramley Moor, why can't we have a different match day experience? So that part of the match day experience is not only watching the match, but it's greeting the players when they turn up, and having something to do between the time where you greet the players and you watch the match. It just all it takes is a somebody to put a program together that says, this is what we're offering you, and these are the benefits for you, and these are the benefits for the team in terms of doing that, and then it happens.
The argument could be put forward that is dependent on the performance of the team, where the motivation is derived from whether the football club hit the bare minimums, as Richard referred to as being a competitive Premier League club. Now,
the big difference between where we are now and where we were, say, 3 months ago, is that there was no evidence, or people said there was no evidence, that what the fans did influenced performance on the pitch. Not so much in terms of what happens in the game, but before the game, when they go away for an away match, turning up at the, at Finch Farm, whatever. I think what the fans have demonstrated more than anything else is that if they're allowed to do so, they can influence events around the club far more than they ever believed they could do, or most importantly, far more than what the club themselves thought they could do. And I think there's a really important lesson to learn from the last few months. And it might not be, it doesn't have to be that we turn up every week like to greet the coach. It could be something else. But the fact is that the fan base, if united, if given a purpose, if given a cause, will respond and do whatever's necessary to help the players, to help the football club. And I think that's the key message that has to go forward, that let's not forget about all of the benefits that the fans have brought the club this season. Let's work on what those benefits can actually produce in the future. And in order to get the benefits, what is it that the fans have to do to provide those benefits? And it would be, from my perspective, just this is the fan base and the fan base response to what's gone on is such a valuable and important asset to the club going forward. It would be ludicrous just to allow it to evaporate until such a time as it was needed again, because we were in, for example, danger of relegation. We should use this as a means of going forward, not as a defensive measure, but as a really positive measure to advance the cause of the club. I
would agree with that wholeheartedly, and I think that is the ideal situation. moving forward and would help that transition from Goodison Park to Bramley Moor Dock. So I think that was a brilliant discussion from the both of you. And just for the last, I'd say 10, 15 minutes, I want to discuss what we expect from Everton Football Club moving forward. Now, Paul, I read your most recent article on Everton's financial position entering the summer, and there were two sentences that jumped out to me most. The first of those was, if I can pull it up now, Mashiri's funds, once lavishly used on player acquisitions, now pay for the stadium and fund continued losses, which I remember being told by Paul Fletcher, who's a former player turned stadium expert, that transfer activity often takes a hit when a club is building or moving to a new stadium, which in turn, I think, stressed the importance of the final sentence of the piece, which was the new collegiate approach to recruitment suggested by Mashiri will require far more from Thelwell and Lampard than Mashiri himself. Now, with that as context and the pressure, I would say, that is on Lampard and Thelwell, given the financial restrictions on the club. Obviously, we know it's not been the best year commercially. What do you think are reasonable expectations for the short term and moving forward?
Reasonable expectations. Unless we're like very, very lucky or clever in the transfer window. And the transfer window is, there's two elements to the transfer window. One is player acquisition, obviously, but particularly in terms of our circumstances, it's actually who we release. So, and release means benefit two ways: one in terms of wages, but also secondly in terms of player trading profits. And I think we have to box really clever here. There's probably a financial need to sell one major player at least, be that DCL or be it Richarlison. I suspect it's DCL rather than Richarlison, but it could be both. And then after that, it's a question of making sure that Thelwell, making sure that Frank Lampard, Clement, Cole, Edwards, etc., make real proper use of whatever resources that allows us to spend. And it sort of predicates the idea that what happened in the past, where Ken Wright maybe, or Mashiri, or Jurabachan, or anybody else, Mina Raiola, who's no longer here, obviously, but those type of agents had an influence on how we spent our money. How we spend our money has to be determined in-house, not out of house. That's how we become a better football club.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I want to pass over to you, Richard. Lampard has stressed the importance of getting a pre-season in with this group of players. I think we've seen in glimpses at the likes of Derby and Chelsea what a Frank Lampard team is. But obviously, as you say, as someone who's been at Goodison frequently under Frank Lampard's, opening half season as Everton manager, what do you think he'll be looking to get out of this group of players? And do you think he will be able to achieve that?
Well, I think it depends on, as Paul says, about which players are sold in terms of obviously the financial needs. I mean, I feel like it's probably more geared towards Richarlison than Calvert-Lewin. I think Calvert-Lewin seems to be quite, I know there's a lot of speculation, but Richarlison seems to be the one who's making the noises, but that doesn't guarantee anything. But I think Lampard sort of did, you alluded to it before, Max, he did the job that he needed to do, similar to when Carlo Ancelotti came in. It wasn't the most easy on the eye style, should we say. It was a lot of 4-4-2 and playing direct and just sticking to the brass tacks. And then the season after the only full season he had in charge, we actually saw a more expansive and more entertaining Everton side. I think there'll be a similar setup with Lampard. It's just who fits the personnel profile. I mean, I've seen reports, source reports that John Joe Kenny's going to be given a new 3-year deal. I mean, I don't really understand that one, if I'm being honest, because you have Nathan Patterson who's coming back from an injury. You've got Seamus Coleman, who seems to be irreplaceable in that starting lineup. And obviously you've got Vitaly Mikalenko and Niels Nkunku at the left back position. So if John Joe Kenny's switching sides, I think he's probably going to be behind those two. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what players fit the profile. I mean, I will say, and we touched upon this a year ago when we discussed Ancelotti's departure. This squad is heavily imbalanced in terms of the numbers in key positions and also the quality of these players. I mean, I think we finished the season here with Everton having players, permanent signings. We're not including loan signings, but permanent signings from 8 different managers. So, David Moyes, Roberto Martinez, Ronald Koeman, Sam Allardyce, Carlo Ancelotti, Marco Silva, Benitez, and Frank Lampard. I mean, only really one of those managers is going to be removed from that sort of equation when Cenk Tosun's contract expires. So it's about working with what you have. But I think the financial situation could be interesting because, there's parallels with 2003-04 when obviously Everton, got 39 points again. We're in a bit of a scrap and had to sell a key player, which then paved the way for multiple big signings who became catalysts, obviously, in the following season. Now, I'm not going to say that Everton are going to be, European contenders, but I do think that selling one of DCL or Richarlison could have a similar knock-on effect in that if Lampard and Farwell scout smartly, Everton will be able to bring in some decent players who could, again, have that impact. Maybe not sort of the Tim Cahill, Marcus Bent, Mikel Arteta sort of impact, but I think they could contribute to what's already there and sort of help raise the levels. But I think stylistically, we need to see some real changes in the players who are in the starting lineup, because I think on Paul's podcast it was alluded to that Everton had sort of changed the centre back pairings pretty much every game in the final weeks of the season. So that there's no continuity in that respect, and obviously Fabian Delph, if he is given a new deal, he's not the most reliable fitness wise. He does break down quite a lot. So there's not really any real continuity in the team spine, and that's something that Lampard's going to have to unearth, and whether that's with the players he's got now or whether he brings some in. I think time will tell. But I think if he wants to get a pre-season in with this squad of players, that seems to hint that he's going to try and settle on a more defined approach in terms of the style and the personnel. And clearly these players served them well in the running, but will they do it next season? I think there's still question marks over some players. Not all, obviously. I think Alex Iwobi in particular is probably vindicated his place in the team, but the likes of Mason Holgate, Michael Keane, if they stick around, there's question marks over them. The Corey and Allen, again, if they don't leave, there's question marks over their suitability to the role. So it's about settling on a good team more than anything, and making sure that they're attuned to the style that Lampard wants to play, because we know he can play good football. We saw it at Chelsea, we saw it at Derby, as you say. It's just making sure that obviously it fits with the tools he's got at his disposal or may bring in.
Certainly, and I think to add to that, a saying that I certainly agree with is that, particularly in football, you live and die by your recruitment. And given our limited wiggle room going into this summer, I think it will be really interesting to see the activity of Everton and the decision making of Frank Lampard and Kevin Thelwell. Now, Paul, have you got anything to add or any further question to throw back to Richard and what he just said?
To be honest, no. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. I think we all have slightly different views in terms of how we get to where we want to get to. But actually, the most important thing is we all know where we want to get to. And that's, once more, having a successful Everton Football Club. And what does success mean? It means competing in European competitions. And it actually means more than that. It means winning silverware.
Certainly. Well, definitely. I mean, I would certainly align with that. point of view. I've heard stories about how successful Everton have been in the past, and guess I was born into the wrong era to expect that from the groups of players that I've saw. But interestingly, I think not to go off on a tangent, but what's something that has always stuck with me is that when Carlo Ancelotti was asked whether if he felt Everton needed silverware or European football more, he, unlike I'd say the bulk of Evertonians, said European football, which I think is in line with financial viability of the club moving forward, which I think is an interesting one. And I look at the likes of West Ham and Leicester, and unfortunately hope we can aim to be back among those ranks of challenging for Europa League places, or Conference League as it is now at the very least. But anyway, I just want to say this podcast has been everything that I wanted and more, to be able to at times take a back seat and listen to both of your opinions. And as you say, Paul, not 100% aligned, but I think that's vitally important to be able to challenge one another, and just to uncover people's, deeper opinions and where they feel like, this football club can go. So I just want to say thanks very much for taking the time out of your evening to speak with me. And as I say, you're always welcome on the podcast in future.
Cheers, Max.
Thank you.